Welcome back, everyone. We are continuing our coverage 5 days a week of the coronavirus, this CCP virus, giving some inside news on what's taking place in China, talking about how that affects the broader world. And so today we're going to be talking about the medical supplies that the Chinese Communist Party has been selling to different countries and a lot of the problems that have been coming up from that. We'll start there. Now, in the Czech Republic, the government confiscated masks and medical supplies from a CCP-linked businessman. The guy's name is Zhou Lingjiang. He was one of the most prominent figures in the Czech Chinese community. And he was trying to sell these medical supplies to the Czech government at incredibly high prices. Now, let's get into what makes this interesting. Now, there's reports in Czech media. It says that when police stormed his warehouse, they confiscated 680,000 masks, these face masks, and 28,000 respirators. This is a quote from one of the Czech reports. It says, Zhou Lingjiang is in charge of the largest overseas Chinese association in the Czech Republic. I'll get into why that matters. He runs the most influential Czech Chinese language media outlet, the Prague Chinese Times, is directly linked to the Chinese government in Beijing, and even accompanied the Czech president, Milo Zeman, on his state visit to China last year. In other words, not a minor figure. Among the confiscated items were boxes with humanitarian aid sent from the hometown where Zhao is from in China to Italy. In other words, among his possessions were Chinese supplies that were supposed to be sent to Italy that somehow he had gotten a hold of and was maybe trying to sell along with these other goods. This is another quote. It says, but the police have also confiscated boxes labeled with Chinese and Italian flags, according to a statement by Zhou's representative. These were humanitarian aid for Italy coming from his home province in China. It's very interesting that he was the head of one of the largest Chinese associations and had known ties to the Chinese Communist Party and was getting close to the Czech president. And I'll explain why. One of my job other than this is I'm senior investigative reporter at the Epoch Times. A lot of my research going back to 2008 was investigating Chinese front operations in the United States. I actually won a couple awards for that reporting. One of the things I uncovered was what they call the United Front. The United Front Work Department, or the United Front Working Department, however you want to translate it. If you were to go on the New York Chinese Consulate website right now, you'd see the United Front Department listed as one of the missions, alongside the Liaison Department. It's a department of the General Political Department, which runs the Chinese Communist Party's political warfare operations. The United Front is how the Chinese Communist Party extends its power into overseas communities. And it works through a few things. One of the big things they do is they go to associations. They call them fraternal organizations, tongs, which is what it appears this guy was in charge of. What are tongs? Long story short, traditional Chinese society, you typically didn't have government below the county level. Below the county level, you had a bottom-up system of government. That was the fraternal organizations, the tongs, the guilds, the family associations, the hometown associations, sometimes different worker guilds, and so on. When the Chinese people immigrated abroad, they maintained that bottom-up system of governance, which is why Chinatowns tend to be so insulated. They're so hard to get into from the outside. They're run by the tongs. Beneath a lot of the tongs are the triads, the Chinese mafia. For example, here in New York City, one of the groups I investigated was the Fujian American Association, one of the closest organizations to the Chinese Communist Party, and beneath which, openly, operates the Fuqing Gang, one of the largest transnational organized crime groups in the world. Human traffickers, drug smugglers, you name it. Now, in the Czech Republic, you might remember we said that 80% of Chinese virus test kits, these CCP virus test kits, were found to be non-functional. In Spain, about 70% were non-functional. There's a huge problem with aid coming out of China right now. Of course, it's not really aid, they sold it to these countries. In the Netherlands, there was another case just recently. They had to recall 600,000 face masks that had ordered from China after finding the masks didn't meet their quality standards and are incapable of protecting against this coronavirus, this CCP virus. Now, that was the 600,000 was close to half of the number they actually purchased. They bought 1.3 million. Now here's something else that's interesting. There's another report. This is from a Chinese news outlet, HKET, coming from, of course, China. Now, 90% of medical supplies being shipped into Europe are being shipped from, guess where? Wuhan, the epicenter of the virus. And of course, there are a lot of questions still about how long can this virus last on materials, plastics, paper, so on. Remember that in China, they actually burned currency. They were worried that the virus could actually stay on money, paper money. And it's unclear, too, how long they can stay on other materials. There was a German report, which I mentioned in an earlier episode, that said the virus can last up to 6 days on plastics. And so if 90% of medical goods being shipped into Europe are coming from Wuhan, the epicenter of the virus, when even inside China they're still wary about things coming out of Wuhan, what does that tell us? This is a quote from HKET, Chinese news outlet. It says, quote, mainland media reported on the 28th that there were 2 Chinese and European trains from Wuhan and Chengdu each morning carrying a large amount of medical supplies to Europe. Now, taking this whole situation in context, guess who else is purchasing Chinese medical supplies now, unfortunately? The United States. This is from the New York Times. It says the U.S. imported medical supplies from China, masks, gloves, gowns, other goods. This is a quote. A commercial aircraft carrying 80 tons of gloves, masks, gowns, and other medical supplies from Shanghai touched down in New York on Sunday, the first of 22 scheduled flights that White House officials say will funnel much-needed goods to the United States by early April as it battles the world's largest coronavirus outbreak. Maybe they didn't see the reports of what's happening in Europe. Maybe it's an issue of the fact that, well, not a lot of countries sell these medical supplies. One of the big issues the United States had with getting these masks and other materials is that most of that was being manufactured in China. The real irony of this is that the main factory that was manufacturing in China was actually an American company. But the Chinese Communist Party, being a communist system, was able to nationalize it, and they forbade exports for a long time. Taiwan decided to change that, announced they were going to open up and send the United States a whole bunch of face masks, and it appears China did the same thing now afterwards. The outbreak in China is worse than what is being reported. Those of you who've been following this channel know. But we have some additional information on that. Now, Senator Marco Rubio said that media reports claiming the U.S. has the most COVID-19 cases is bad journalism. If you've watched some of these press briefings, you can see mainstream news journalists raising their hands and questioning, what does it mean if the United States has higher numbers than China? Does this mean the U.S. isn't handling it as well as China? The Chinese Communist Party is spreading this narrative. American news outlets are not only repeating it, but feeding it. That's what's happening right now. And of course, that analysis, that entire angle is based on just the idea if they're actually believing the numbers coming out of China, which, as we've reported numerous times, are not reliable, not accurate, and a lot of the evidence suggests that the number is way higher in China. We'll be going over a bit more of that right now, in fact. So this is from the Daily Wire. We'll go over a few different sources. British scientific advisors claim China's outbreak could be 15 to 40 times worse than reported. This is from Business Insider. Boris Johnson's government is furious with China and believes it could have 40 times the number of coronavirus cases. Quote, UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson's government is said to be furious with China, accusing it of spreading disinformation and lying about the number of coronavirus cases it has. Another quote, some of the reporting from China was not clear about the scale, the nature, the infectiousness of this. This is a quote from the Minister for the Cabinet Office, Michael Gove. And this is another quote from the story. Estimates from Radio Free Asia show that up to 42,000 bodies have been cremated in Wuhan since the crisis. 42,000 bodies cremated in Wuhan. which is the epicenter of the virus, the main city in Hubei province. 42,000. Now let's look at what the Chinese Communist Party is saying, right? It says, now the Chinese Communist Party claims to have 81,470 cases and about 3,304 deaths. They're saying 3,304 deaths. American mainstream news is using that as the basis of their analysis to criticize the United States, ironically, using the same line of analysis as the Chinese Communist Party at the same time they're launching this propaganda campaign against the United States. But if these 40 times number is accurate, that would put the numbers of cases in China at 3.25 million and 132,160 deaths. Now, the Epoch Times has reported, as some of you might remember, that there were 21 million fewer cell phone users suddenly in China, which may suggest that the death toll is higher in China much higher than what's being reported. The important part to know when it comes to the 21 million fewer cell phone accounts is that in China you can't just cancel your cell phone account. Yeah, I mean, you have your number and so on, but you can't just cancel your account. Your account is tied to your social security number. Your account is tied to your bank account. Your account is tied to your government health code. You can't just get rid of that. It's a totalitarian communist system. 21 million accounts disappear. What does that tell us? Meanwhile, the Chinese Communist Party is going around and now providing ashes of people who died of the virus to people's loved ones. The Chinese Communist Party has put a daily limit on the number of cases of ashes that they give out. They're only allowed to give out 500 cases a day, at least in the epicenter. And this is, of course, raising concerns on two sides. One is that the Chinese Communist Party has been lying about the number of dead, and even some mainstream news outlets are pointing out that, well, if they're giving out this amount of ashes each day, and they're doing it for so many days, then the number is way higher than what they're reporting already. We've been talking for a while about the risk of a second wave outbreak taking place in China. Xi Jinping, head of the Chinese Communist Party, just went to Zhejiang to push people to return back to work in order to save the Chinese economy from collapsing. This is a quote from RFL. Wuhan closed the city and Hubei closed the province, followed by Zhejiang, Jiangsu, Shanghai, and Guangdong. These are the most important areas of the Chinese economy, and all stopped. But why the Chinese Communist Party is basically saying the virus is over, now go back to work. And of course Xi Jinping now going to Zhejiang and saying, okay, everybody get back to work or the economy is going to collapse. The Chinese Communist Party did an assessment. They found that close to a third of the businesses in China were about to go out of business. Because people were not working, factories were closed down, international exports are basically cut off, a lot of them from China. And so what does the Chinese Communist Party do? Well, after finding out that its economy is going to collapse, it's probably going to lose power, it says, okay, virus is over, time to go back to work, everybody. And while they're telling everybody to go back to work, they still canceled their annual party conference. And so it's okay for the average Chinese person to go back to work. But Chinese Communist Party officials, no, not safe enough to meet. Not safe enough to get back together. What does that tell us? Now, China News Network reported something interesting. That while Xi is traveling around and telling people to go back to work, especially in major economic hubs, the CCP media are reporting of a risk of asymptomatic infections. And I'll go over a few different parts of this. This is from China News Network. It says, quote, "The epidemic situation is not over yet. The question of asymptomatic infection has to be solved." This is from Caixin, another Chinese news outlet. Premier of the CCP's State Council, Li Keqiang, is saying, quote, "We must attach great importance to the prevention and treatment of asymptomatic infections." And he's also claiming that people are not allowed to conceal false negatives. In other words, they're claiming that people are not allowed to not report these cases or conceal information on false negatives. Which is a bit ridiculous because, as we know, the Chinese Communist Party is not going to make this public. Very likely, though, the Chinese Communist Party itself wants to know what the real numbers are, even if they don't tell the rest of the world. Xinhua is reporting that in Zhejiang there was a press conference, this is of course where Xi Jinping just was, saying that asymptomatic patients with this virus are a prominent hidden danger in the current epidemic prevention and control. Local authorities seem to be themselves defying the top-level orders of the Chinese Communist Party. You may remember that we reported about these mass protests, these riots that took place on a bridge heading out of Hubei province, when the Chinese Communist Party told people it was safe to go back to work. Allegedly, now what happened was police blocked the bridge they were trying to cross, and people were so mad they started overturning Chinese police cars. It turned into a riot. They sent out riot police. It appears that wasn't from top-level Chinese Communist Party. It appears that was local officials who themselves decided they weren't going to risk infecting the local province. In other words, there appears to be a break taking place between provincial officials and top-level Chinese Communist Party officials. Things are starting to break. Now, this is from Financial Times, something interesting, saying that local authorities appear to be defying the CCP on lifting restrictions. It says, quote, "The problem is most acute for residents of Hubei, the province worst affected by coronavirus. A strict lockdown of the province ended on Wednesday, but many of its 6 million residents who work in other parts of China are finding it impossible to leave, as other local authorities defy central government orders and refuse to lift travel restrictions." And this is from Radio Free Asia. It says the China's president, Xi Jinping, not really a president because he's not elected, but anyways, is feeling the pressure from dissent in his own party. An open letter circulating online since last week calls for an emergency expanded meeting of the Politburo, the Chinese Communist Party Politburo Committee, to discuss Xi's issues, Xi Jinping, and to decide if he should step down from his leadership of the party, government, and military. Of course, it's unclear where that actually came from. As we've reported before on this channel, there are two different factions in China, political factions, fighting for control. There's the Xi Jinping faction and the Jiang Zemin faction, neither of which is good. The Jiang faction is much, much worse. And so Xi Jinping just stepping down is not going to solve the problem of the Chinese Communist Party's totalitarian, brutal regime. It is just going to switch the head of it. That's all it's going to do. And so, in my analysis, if a letter is calling for Xi, just Xi to step down, that is not going to change anything in China. Very likely the other faction, the Jiang faction, would take control, or someone within Xi's own party system would take control. It would make no difference. But there's the broader picture of this is interesting. One is that the Chinese Communist Party, all the state-run media right now, are warning about asymptomatic cases. People who aren't showing symptoms but who can still infect people. And it's interesting they're choosing to focus on the asymptomatic patients, asymptomatic cases, because those are not the ones being treated. These are people who would be unknowingly spreading the virus. And we've seen reports saying that 2 weeks to 40 days, people sometimes don't show symptoms and they can spread it to people around them. This gives the Chinese Communist Party an alibi if there is a second wave outbreak to say, oh, it was asymptomatic cases, we tried our best. But as we see now, their biggest concern is saving the Chinese economy from collapse, saving the Chinese Communist Party system from collapsing. The Chinese Communist Party is still trying to hide the origin of this virus, of this CCP virus. Now, this is from CCTV, one of the main Chinese state-run media. It's citing a report in the journal Journal Medicine in the United States from an American scientist claiming the virus is natural. Chinese Communist Party using American scientists to spread its propaganda. CCTV emphasized that, quote, "The new coronavirus is not constructed in a laboratory, nor was it a purposeful man-made virus." Of course. It claims the virus spread in Wuhan but did not originate in Wuhan. This is again the ongoing narrative the Chinese Communist Party is trying to spread. It's saying the virus started in China but did not necessarily originate in China. It is using these foreign experts, scientists, and so on, and cherry-picking data to frame its narratives. It's interesting now that even Iran appears to be breaking with the Chinese Communist Party. Now, we've reported before that the number of dead in Iran are so high that you can see the mass graves from space. We're seeing an odd phenomena that it seems to be a lot of Iranian officials, government officials, are the ones catching the virus. The Atlantic broke down the numbers. Of course, Iran is very much like the Chinese Communist Party, where a centralized totalitarian regime controls just about everything, and so they can say whatever they want. The Atlantic looked at the numbers, broke them down. They put the estimated number of cases in Iran at 2 million. And now Iran is pointing at China as the one to blame for this. They're calling out the CCP. Chinese propaganda agents are continuing to spread these false narratives again that the virus, well, it started in China, but did not necessarily originate in China. Again, this is the psychological, manipulative tactic they're using. A way of taking something you see objectively, something you see, and changing the conclusion you come to when interpreting it. This is from Chinascope. It says the Chinese Communist Party is spreading disinformation that American soldiers spread the virus in China during the military World Games that were held in Wuhan in October 2019. And this is a quote from that report. Since March 16, a video of an American spreading the virus on the Wuhan subway train during the military World Games has widely spread on Weibo and WeChat, two of the main social media platforms in China. In the video, a foreigner pulled out his face mask, licked his fingers, and then wiped his hands on the handles of the subway cart. The video displayed the Chinese subtitles, quote, "During the military World Games, Americans were spreading the virus. Please watch it. The U.S. is so awful." Many Chinese netizens criticized the United States out of anger after watching the video. Now, in China, under the Chinese Communist Party, where they have the Great Firewall, where they have the Chinese Internet Police, where they have the 50-cent army, where they have propagandists, where they have the General Propaganda Department that oversees everything, nothing goes viral. Nothing spreads unless the Chinese Communist Party lets it spread. And so this is not spreading by accident in China. And of course, the Chinese Communist Party is using that exact narrative, internally and externally. This is from ProPublica. They did an investigative report looking into Chinese Twitter propaganda, Chinese Communist Party Twitter propaganda. And they showed that the Chinese Communist Party has not only been creating fake accounts to spread propaganda on the American Twitter, right, on English language Twitter, but they're even hijacking accounts from legitimate users. They have stories of, young girls finding out that their Twitter account is spreading Chinese propaganda because they got hijacked. This is a quote from the article. Since August 2019, ProPublica has tracked more than 10,000 suspected fake Twitter accounts involved in a coordinated influence campaign with ties to the Chinese government. Among those are the hacked accounts of users from around the world that now post propaganda and disinformation about the coronavirus outbreak, the Hong Kong protests, and other topics of state interest. They include a professor in North Carolina, a graphic artist and a mother in Massachusetts, a web designer in the UK, and a business analyst in Australia. And I'm sure a lot of you have actually seen this too. Go on any say, semi-viral tweet that relates to the coronavirus, relates to the CCP virus, and I guarantee you, you're going to see Chinese propagandists leaving comments on there. Now, a bit of history on this. The Chinese Communist Party has, of course, many different organizations that do this. In 2016, the Washington Post did an analysis, and they found the Chinese Communist Party faked close to 450 million social media comments a year through the 50-cent army. Paid Chinese propagandists who leave comments on the internet. The Epoch Times had an exclusive in mid-February where we got leaked documents from the propaganda department in Hubei province, which is where Wuhan is, saying they deployed 1,600 online trolls to censor news on the coronavirus outbreak. And we actually had another leaked document in February late February. It was Chinese government documents in Hubei, again where Wuhan is, and it detailed priorities to, quote, control the society and, quote, manipulate public opinion, to control how the CCP is perceived and to frame news on the virus. This is a quote from the article we had on that. Authorities of the city of Xi'an, for example, listed their working targets as, quote, monitor closely petitioners and people whose benefits have been severely damaged. In other words, people most likely to dissent against the authorities. To, quote, strictly prevent key people and groups from assembling and making trouble. And to, quote, punish heavily the people who spread improper speech or rumors related to the epidemic. And under the Chinese Communist Party, improper speech could be anything that criticizes the Chinese Communist Party, and rumors is anything other than the official narrative the regime is spreading. Meanwhile, there was a high-speed rail crash that took place in China. The government said that nobody died, but 100 people were injured, and people aren't buying. There are some videos coming out from the ground, and yes, they show people who look like they're dead. We can show some of those here. They're not graphic. This was not the first time something like this has happened in China either. You might remember back in 2011, it was in Zhejiang province, that a high-speed train in China derailed. It was going over a kind of a lower-ish bridge, derailed, fell off the bridge, and the Chinese Communist Party reported that only 38 people died and 192 were injured, very similar to this current case. And then what does the Chinese Communist Party do as soon as people start questioning whether the death toll was, say, altered to hide how many people actually died when a high-speed train derailed and went off a bridge and then crashed into the ground? They literally buried the evidence. They buried the wreckage of the train. Now, that said, let's move on to some questions and comments from our viewers. And folks, if you're watching this, you want me to answer questions, you want to leave a comment, you want me to read it on the show, let me know in the comments. I read them, I'll go through them. First up, we have Corey Wright. He says the CCP not only destroyed churches, but synagogues and temples too. And that is absolutely correct. The Chinese Communist Party, as we speak, is tearing down churches. In China, they have the official state-run version of the Christian and Catholic Church, and they have the Chinese Communist Party version. If you're following the Chinese Communist Party version, you cannot recognize a power higher than the Communist Party. If you're a Christian, you follow the 10 Commandments. The first commandment is knocked off. It is not there. They've removed it. If you're a Catholic, you cannot recognize the Pope. They've changed this a bit because Pope Francis has bowed down to the CCP to an extent. But as we speak too, they're tearing down temples in Tibet. They're tearing down churches. They're tearing down crosses. The Chinese Communist Party persecutes Muslim Uyghurs. They have full-scale concentration camps. They persecute Falun Gong practitioners. 70 million to 100 million people. Next question is from Ariel Vivar. Never believe anything the CCP says. They are a scourge to the Chinese people and the world. And very true. The Chinese Communist Party does not represent the Chinese people. The Chinese people are the biggest victims of the Chinese Communist Party, not just in China but around the world. The Chinese Communist Party under Mao Zedong alone killed somewhere between 50 million and 70 million Chinese people. Right now, as we speak, the Chinese Communist Party has the United Front Department, which I've mentioned before. In fact, operating openly in a lot of places, including in New York. You can see it listed on the Chinese consulate website. The Chinese Communist Party's United Front Department monitors local Chinese people, threatens them, threatens their families, they step out of line. There are people in America, American citizens, who do not feel safe from their foreign government because of this. In addition to that, the Chinese Communist Party continues to persecute religious believers, democracy activists, and anyone who speaks out against its regime. It is again a totalitarian regime that in no way represents the Chinese people. This is from BJ Gosh. Hey Joshua, is there any investigation going on towards China and WHO? Because the facts that are there aroused suspicion they could have averted this pandemic. Yeah, we've had some coverage here on the WHO. If you want to watch a good video talking about the WHO and the Chinese Communist Party's influence on it, actually China Uncensored had a great video on that, which we'll link here. I can look into getting some information on this. I actually have some good contacts who've researched this. Maybe we can get them on for an interview. We'll see about that. Next is from Ava Yu. She said, "Thanks, Joshua. Most people in the US and the world are so ignorant of what is really going on because they lack depth of knowledge in the evil Communist China Party regime, both historical and current." She says, "In my opinion, isn't it obvious and logistical that the potent contagion came out of the Wuhan P4 lab, especially if Xi's political nemesis pretty much runs the lab?" Excellent analysis and commentary. Thank you. Thank you, Abba. I appreciate it. And yeah, so a bit on that. It's true. Now, when you talk about Xi's political nemesis pretty much running the lab, that's the Jiang faction. The Xi Jinping controls the military. This was more of a recent thing. There's power struggles. Not everything is controlled by Xi in China. The labs are still under the control of the Jiang faction. The head of that P4 lab, a Miss Xi, is very close to Jiang Zemin's son, again the head of the rival faction. Who knows if it was intentional or not? Who knows if it actually came from that lab? In any normal case, every normal country would be calling for an investigation into that lab, because the narratives the Chinese Communist Party has given us have all been lies. It's said that the epicenter of the virus, the place it started, was this Wuhan seafood market. That was an absolute lie. It was proven false. They found that patient 0 had zero connection, no connection whatsoever to that marketplace, nor did a lot of the early infections. The Chinese Communist Party even stopped using that narrative. And then when you ask about the intermediary species, how did it spread from bats to humans? Well, they cleaned up the crime scene. They went into that marketplace and wiped everything down, destroyed all the evidence. There's no way of knowing. When the world started asking for an answer on that, what does the Chinese Communist Party do? They say the intermediary species was the pangolin, that kind of aardvark-looking creature they have there. And guess what? That was proven false as well. The journal Nature debunked it. And so the Chinese Communist Party lied to us about the origin. They lied to us about the intermediary species. And somehow the world is just okay with being lied to. We're not questioning it further. And if you question it further, you're called a conspiracy theorist. When 20 miles up the road from that epicenter is a P4 laboratory that was researching, studying coronaviruses, bat coronaviruses, and the SARS virus. They were studying viruses exactly like this. And the head of that laboratory, that Miss Xi, was publishing public reports that very closely fit the description of this current virus. In fact, even talking about synthetic viruses they created. They were increasing the virulence of viruses. This was banned in the U.S. I think back in 2014 under the Obama administration. They were doing that type of research there. They published a report on this artificial virus they created, and they found that it destroyed the lungs of mice. And they were proud about it. They wrote about it. They had papers on it. It was public. And then they announced that they were going to continue their research on primates. Now, what's most interesting is that during the 2018 swine flu outbreak and these different things they had in China, that P4 laboratory was making noise. They were, the heroic Chinese Communist Party advanced scientific researchers, trying to save China from this outbreak, according to the narrative. This outbreak, they are dead silent. They're not making any noise whatsoever. So what's going on? Next comment from Kurian Matthew. The West is not totally blameless because of their insatiable want of cheap goods and massive profits. They let China do another long march into the whole world. Curry and I agree with you. I think that the big corporations have demonstrated incredible corruption with their working with the Chinese Communist Party. In fact, even some big tech companies that have helped the Chinese Communist Party develop surveillance systems and other things that have been used by the Chinese regime in its human rights abuses. I believe these companies should be held responsible for what they've done. And yeah, you're right. It's greed, it's financial interests that have allowed the Chinese Communist Party to do what it has done to its own people and to the world. Next is from Ben Chiang. Not only the CCP not meeting together, they don't let their children to come back home. Stay put the country they are in. Yeah, that's true. The Chinese Communist Party is telling the world that, oh, the virus is over, the outbreak is over. China is the safest place. We're the ones most capable of handling it. A lot of Chinese people are hearing that and they're going back to China only to be put into quarantine. And when they get put into quarantine, they're found to have the virus. They're telling their relatives, don't come, don't come. And guess what's happening? The Chinese Communist Party is using this internally for its own propaganda because they're saying the infections that they're finding now are imported infections. Now they're switching the narrative and saying other countries are bringing the virus into China because, oh, they don't have totalitarian communism. They're not handling it like we did. And so they're using this as propaganda to point their fingers. But meanwhile, like Ben said, Chinese Communist Party leaders know what's going on in China, and they're telling their friends and family members, stay where you are, don't come to China. Next is from Barbara Lingjam. China is a capitalist country with the CCP representing the elite. Not true. The Chinese Communist Party, all the big companies are run by the Chinese Communist Party. You could say it's state capitalism, which is what Lenin, was the name he used for socialism. Keep in mind that there's a lot of different information on socialism, communism, and a lot of confusion about this. The Chinese regime is very much ruled by the Chinese Communist Party. They are in every way a communist regime. If your business gets big enough, you and every one of your employees has to join the Communist Party. If you get big enough, you have to have a Communist Party liaison sent to your business. The Chinese regime can nationalize your business, it can control foreign investment, it can dictate everything you do. It is a communist system. If you're a Communist Party member, you have to join these weekly study sessions of communist texts, the whole 9 yards. It is in every way a communist regime. It is true that they had this reform and opening up where they've allowed the Chinese people to start their own businesses and engage to a small extent in the free market. If they get big enough, the Chinese Communist Party system envelops them and uses them. They become part of the Communist Party system. But keep in mind that no communist system has ever fully gotten rid of, let's say, the factories or the businesses. Maybe the only exception to that would be the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia, where they took everyone and shipped them out to the countryside and forced them to work in the killing fields. They killed about a third of the population. When it comes to socialist systems, though, they always maintain the big businesses. They always maintain the big corporations. The only difference is it's state capitalism. The state controls the capitalist systems. They control the means of production. That is what communism is. They don't get rid of them. They control them. They subsidize them. And so the Chinese Communist Party is in every way functioning like that. Lenin even talked about this shortly after the Bolshevik Revolution, where he wrote a paper saying along the lines of, can we advance towards communism if we fear the stage of socialism? And he talked about the need of socialism as the system of state capitalist monopoly. And that's what it is. It is a state-run system where the government monopolizes the capitalist systems. And that's exactly what China is. Next is from MR. I'm confused that the Chinese system is a socialist system, but everyone has to pay for their own medical care. And that's right, too. There are carrots that communist systems dangle in front of people to entice them to hand over their rights. And as soon as they hand over their rights, they get a bit of interest for a little bit. Eventually, those things are not found to be sustainable. The benefits go away. The totalitarian regime stays, which is exactly what happened in China. Now, with that said, folks, please tune in next time. We're going to be doing this 5 days a week, doing heavy coverage on the coronavirus, the CCP virus. Questions, comments, leave them in the comments below. I'll get to them, I'll read them, I'll read some on the next episode. And with that said, folks, please remember to like and subscribe. We really need your support. Click the notification bell, you get alerts when our new videos are up. See you next time.